At 95 years old, Clint Eastwood is living through one of the strangest and most emotional chapters of his life. Grief, rumors, unfinished work, and a career so enormous that Hollywood still does not quite know what to do with him. This is the man who spent 7 decades becoming the definition of toughness. The squint, the growl, the refusal to bend for anyone. But behind the legend is someone dealing with loss, aging, and a world that still cannot stop watching him. And somehow, against all odds, Clint Eastwood just keeps going. To understand why this chapter feels so heavy, you first have to understand the scale of the life he built. Born on May 31st, 1930, in San Francisco, Eastwood became one of the most recognizable faces in movie history. He exploded onto screens in the 1960s as the mysterious gunslinger in The Good, The Bad and the Ugly and the rest of Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy. Those films changed westerns forever. Suddenly cool was quieter. Toughness was colder. And Clint Eastwood became the face of it all. But that was only the beginning. Because then came Dirty Harry, and with it one of the most quoted lines in cinema history, "Go ahead, make my day." But here is what many people missed. Acting was only half the story. Behind the camera, Eastwood was building something even bigger. And what happened next surprised almost everyone. In 1971, he directed his first film, Play Misty for Me. From there, he never stopped. Over the next several decades he directed more than 40 movies, moving effortlessly from westerns to war dramas to emotional character studies. Then came the turning point. Unforgiven earned him Academy Awards for both Best Director and Best Picture. Years later, he did it again with $1 Million Baby. Most stars from his era slowly faded into retirement. Eastwood did the opposite. While others accepted Lifetime Achievement Awards and looked backward, he kept making films. Into his 80s. Into his 90s. Still showing up to work every day. Still chasing the next story. But then something happened that made even longtime fans wonder if the end was finally near. Or was it? In 2024, at 94 years old, Eastwood directed Juror No. 2, a courtroom thriller starring Nicholas Hoult, Toni Collette, J.K. Simmons, and Kiefer Sutherland. Critics loved it. The film earned glowing reviews and landed a certified fresh score above 90% on Rotten Tomatoes. Not bad for a director pushing 95. But then came the strange part. Warner Brothers, the studio that had worked with Eastwood for decades, gave the film an incredibly limited theatrical release. Fewer than 50 screens across North America. A critically praised Clint Eastwood movie was almost hidden away like an afterthought. Fans were stunned. Industry insiders were confused. And suddenly people began talking about the film as if it were a farewell. But Clint Eastwood never said it was. In fact, the truth turned out to be very different. Reports soon appeared claiming Eastwood was already planning another project. People close to him describe him as a workaholic who simply did not know how to stop creating. Then things got even stranger. Around his 95th birthday in 2025, an Austrian newspaper published what looked like a brand new interview with him. The quote spread around the world almost instantly. There was just one problem. Eastwood said the interview was completely fake. In a calm public statement, he explained that he had never spoken to the publication at all. No angry outburst. No dramatic reaction. Just a short correction and silence afterward. That response told people everything about him. Quiet. Controlled. Direct. But while the internet obsessed over fake interviews and retirement rumors, the real story unfolding in Clint Eastwood's life was something far more personal. And far more heartbreaking. For nearly 10 years, Eastwood shared his life with Christina Sandera. The two reportedly met around 2014 at his Mission Ranch property in Carmel by the Sea. She worked there as a hostess. He was already a living legend. Yet somehow they built a relationship almost completely outside the spotlight. Think about how rare that is in Hollywood.
No endless interviews. No magazine covers.
No public spectacle. She quietly appeared beside him at events and premieres over the years, but they protected their private world fiercely. And maybe that privacy made what happened next even more painful. On July 18, 2024, Christina Sandera passed away at the age of 61. Reports later confirmed the cause involved cardiac arrhythmia and coronary artery disease. Eastwood released only a brief statement afterward. He called her a lovely, caring woman and said, "I will miss her very much." That was it. 6 simple words carrying the weight of a decade together. No long tribute. No emotional performance for cameras. Just grief handled quietly, the same way he had handled almost everything in his life. And somehow that silence made it even more emotional. But while many people focused on the loss, there was another side of Clint Eastwood that suddenly began drawing attention again. A side most casual fans never truly knew about. And honestly, it changes how you see him completely. Long before the movies. Before the squint. Before the cowboy image. Clint Eastwood loved music. Especially jazz and blues. His mother introduced him to the music of Fats Waller when he was still a child, and something clicked immediately. Eastwood taught himself piano by ear, spending hours replaying records and hammering out melodies at the family piano. He later admitted he drove his mother crazy practicing the same riffs over and over again. As a teenager in Oakland, he sneaked into jazz clubs to watch legends like Charlie Parker perform. At one point, he seriously considered a life in music instead of acting. But even after Hollywood found him, music never really left. And what he eventually did with that passion shocked people. Eastwood quietly built a serious musical life alongside his film career. He composed music for several of his own movies. He directed Bird, a deeply personal film about Charlie Parker. He created the documentary Piano Blues. Then came perhaps the most surprising detail of all. In 1997, at 67 years old, Clint Eastwood performed jazz piano at Carnegie Hall. Think about that for a second. After decades as one of the toughest men in Hollywood, after Oscars and Westerns and global fame, he was still sitting behind a piano chasing the music he loved as a child. That image says more about him than almost any movie role ever could. And maybe that is why this stage of his life feels so emotional. Because underneath the legend, people are finally seeing the person. Aging is difficult for anyone. But aging in public, while carrying 60 years of cultural mythology on your shoulders, is something entirely different. The world has always wanted Clint Eastwood to stay frozen as an icon. The cowboy. The gunslinger. The unstoppable force. What people rarely wanted to see was the human being underneath all of it. But now that humanity is impossible to ignore. In the same period when his latest film struggled with studio support, he also lost the woman he quietly loved for 10 years. At the same time, false interviews and retirement stories swirled around him online. Yet through all of it, he kept working, kept showing up, kept developing new ideas. That kind of endurance feels almost unreal at 95 years old. But maybe it makes more sense when you hear what his son Scott Eastwood once said about him. Scott described his father as someone shaped by the Great Depression and a lifetime of hardship. You do not complain. You do not whine. You just keep going. That attitude seems woven into everything Clint Eastwood does. Even grief. Even aging. Even public chaos. He absorbs it quietly and moves forward anyway. And maybe that is why this chapter feels so powerful. Because the gap between Clint Eastwood the icon and Clint Eastwood the person has never been smaller. For the first time in a long time, people are seeing both at once. When you step back and look at the full picture, the scale of his life becomes almost unbelievable. He entered Hollywood during the old studio system of the 1950s. He reinvented westerns in the 60s. He created one of cinema's most famous anti-heroes in the 70s. He evolved into a respected filmmaker in the 80s and 90s. Then he delivered masterpieces like Mystic River, Letters from Iwo Jima, Gran Torino, American Sniper, Sully, and Richard Jewell. Then, somehow, at 94 years old, he delivered another critically praised film with Juror Number 2. That is not just a career. It feels like an entire era of cinema embodied in one person. But through all of it, one thing stayed constant. The music. The piano. The quiet private world behind the fame. Somewhere, even now, Clint Eastwood is probably still sitting at a piano. Maybe in California. Maybe between meetings for another film project nobody knows about yet. Maybe simply playing for himself the way he did as a kid. And perhaps that is the real story here. Not the rumors. Not the headlines. Not even the awards. The real story is that at 95 years old, after heartbreak and loss and decades of carrying the weight of fame, he still has the desire to create. Still has the discipline to keep moving forward. Still refuses to perform a dramatic farewell for the world. Hollywood keeps waiting for Clint Eastwood to deliver some grand final goodbye. But Clint Eastwood has never done things on anyone else's schedule. And maybe that refusal to stop, refusal to fade quietly into the past, is the most Clint Eastwood thing imaginable. What stays with you after looking at this chapter of his life is not just the legend. It is the humanity underneath it. A man who spent 70 years creating stories while quietly protecting his own. A man who loved deeply without turning it into publicity. A man who carried music with him from childhood all the way into old age. A man who responds to chaos with silence and keeps working anyway. Clint Eastwood has never needed permission from the world to continue. And at 95 years old, he still does not.